It's 7:01 or 7:02. We're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to tonight's webinar entitled Mindsight, Compassional Pastoral Attention to Self and Others. I'm your host, Michael Danner. I'm the Associate Executive Director for Church Vitality for Mennonite Church USA, and I'm pleased to have Sarah Bixler, Associate Dean of the Seminary at Eastern Mennonite University here with us. Just a few notes before we get started. This gathering is in webinar format, so all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat for some different information. If you are a Spanish speaker, interpretation is available, and also a link to the PowerPoint in Spanish will be in the chat, so you can get that there. We certainly welcome your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Only the panelists will be able to see your questions, and we will also answer some of your pre-submitted questions as time allows at the end of the webinar. Let's open in prayer, and then I'll introduce Sarah, and we'll get going. Gracious God, we thank you for this evening, and I thank you for each person that's here, and for Sarah for sharing with us these insights about pastoring and pastoral self and mindsight and the things that she is going to share with us tonight. We're coming via technology, and as always, that comes with challenges. So we just pray that the tech will work, and we'll be able to hear each other clearly and gain the wisdom and insight that you have for us this evening. So be with us and be with Sarah as we engage in this webinar. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. Just a brief bio for Sarah. Reverend Dr. Sarah Ann Bixler is Associate Dean of the Seminary and teaches formation and practical theology at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. She holds a PhD in practical theology and an MDiv from Princeton Theological Seminary and a BA in English education from Eastern Mennonite University. Sarah, along with her spouse Benjamin and their 3 children, attend Parkview Mennonite Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Welcome, Sarah. We're glad to have you. And the screen is yours.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to be here with you all this evening for this webinar on Mindsight, which is a made-up term. As we were aware, as we talked with Spanish translators this evening, there's not a great translation for this because it's a term that was coined by Dr. Daniel Siegel, who is a clinical professor of psychiatry and on the cutting edge of a field called interpersonal neurobiology. And this word mindsight is something that came to my mind a couple of months ago when Michael and Rachel Ringenberg-Miller invited me to be on the Competent Pastor podcast and asked what's the most important skill of a competent pastor. And this idea of mindsight is something that rose to the forefront of my mind. And so this is what we'll talk about this evening together, learning what is meant by this term, mindsight. What are some of the signs that we might be losing our capacity for it? And what practices could we try that might cultivate and help us to regain this important pastoral skill? And indeed, I see this as a spiritual practice, this practice of mindsight. So something that we're going to do is sprinkle practices for you to engage your body and your mind throughout this webinar. And so to begin, I want to start us off with what's called a body scan. This is something that you can do to a great extent with a longer attention to your sensations within your physical body, or you can do it relatively quickly by simply asking yourself, are there points of tension or relaxation that I feel in my body right now? But we're going to do a little bit more of an extended version of this. It'll take us about 2 or 3 minutes. And so I invite you to close your eyes if you would like to, which may give you greater attention to your body as you are here this evening. When we enter a webinar like this, it might be at the end of a day where you've had a lot going on, perhaps. You are coming from somewhere else and you feel like you might not quite be fully here yet. So it's important to engage in this way, just to recognize where we are and how we're showing up in our bodies. So I invite you to close your eyes if you like and begin by bringing attention into your body and notice where it is. Are you seated, or how are you postured as you're showing up now? And I invite you to feel the weight of your body, perhaps on a chair, perhaps part of your body is touching the floor, and take a few deep breaths. Bring in oxygen to enliven your body. And as you exhale, have a sense of relaxing, perhaps more deeply. Notice your feet, if they're on the floor or whatever they are touching, and notice the sensation of your feet resting in place. Notice any weight and pressure. Maybe there's a little vibration or even heat that you can feel. And now we're going to scan upward. Notice your legs. Are they touching a chair, perhaps? Is there any pressure in them? Is there heaviness or lightness? I invite you to draw your attention to your back. Are you leaning against anything? How does it feel? And bring your attention into your torso and stomach area. If there's any tension or tightness there, I invite you to let it soften. And take another breath. And now we'll notice the hands. Do your hands feel tense or tight? See if you can allow your fingers to relax and your hands to soften. Notice your arms. Are there any sensations that you're aware of in your arms? And your shoulders. We can often carry a lot of tension in our shoulders. I invite you to let your shoulders be soft. You might even want to feel like there's some unknown weight pulling them down toward the floor. Let your shoulders droop and be soft. And now notice your neck and your throat, and see if you can relax them. Soften your jaw too. We often carry tension in our jaw. Let your face and the muscles in your face be soft. And now take in your whole body present. And take one more breath. Be aware of your whole body as best you can. And I invite you to breathe in for 3 counts and out for 5. In for 3 and out for 5. And let's scan our body back down now. Focus on your face and your jaw, your neck and your throat, your shoulders, your arms, your hands, your torso and your stomach, your back, your legs. And once again, feel your feet resting on the floor or wherever they are. Take one more breath in and out. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes. This kind of body scan practice helps us check in with where we are and how we're showing up. And it improves our capacity for Mindsight. In the first movement of Mindsight, which is a look inward, Mindsight is a term for both how we see our own minds and the minds of others, and for our ability to honor these different parts at the same time as we link together. And the first movement of Mindsight is to sense your own inner mental life. Insight. It's like a map of yourself inside. The second movement of Mindsight is to turn outward in empathy to sense another person's inner mental life, like a map of what might possibly be going on inside of them. And then the third movement of Mindsight is integration, to link these different parts into an interconnected whole, to realize that we experience life together, that we are not alone, that we all impact each other and are connected to one another. We might think about even how our own inner life can represent separation or connection. We want our memories, our life narrative, the realities of our brain and our body to be connected, just as we want to be connected to other people as well. Dr. Daniel Siegel, whose book Mindsight I'm drawing extensively from for this webinar this evening, writes that integration creates coordination and balance in our inner and interpersonal worlds. So why is Mindsight important? Because pastoral ministry is demanding. It requires immense inner resources and attention to self and others and God. It requires a consistent quality of presence that is often difficult to maintain in the midst of church and community crises, in the midst of the daily demands of ministry, and in the general uncertainty of life. As pastors might feel overwhelmed, we lose touch with these skills of compassion and empathy that are really essential for pastoral ministry. And if we've lost awareness of ourselves in the presence of God, we cannot be present to others. We've surely heard a lot about the term burnout. Perhaps you've heard about the great resignation that is seen in clergy in North America. I want to invite Crystal to show the first and second slide now that I've prepared about clergy strain. I was part of a trauma and spirituality conference a couple of weeks ago, and I'm so mindful of the devastation of fires that is sweeping through Southern California right now. I was at this conference on the campus of Fuller Theological Seminary, and so I am just holding all who have been affected so close in my heart as they experience the destruction of the force of fire. At that conference, several pieces of new and recent data were shared. So I'm sharing these with you now from a project called the Parsonage Project. Full-time clergy now report working 55 to 70 hours a week. That's without accounting for breaks. Clergy rates of post-traumatic stress disorder have now surpassed the rates of the US military. Clergy are frequently the first line of support for people who experience crisis. Before someone calls the police or reaches out to a counselor or consults a medical provider, they are more inclined to reach out to a clergy person. And to make matters worse, many clergy and their congregations think about self-care as a selfish act. And this creates this terrible storm where there's work, there's trauma symptoms from carrying other people's pain, and there is not understanding or room for self-care. This is why Mindsight is important. And I'm going to share with you a number of practices that might be possible for you to try out, ones that are pretty quick to try out and ones that are more extensive and in-depth. So Mindsight is a skill that is a way to focus our attention. Like I said, first on our inner experience, then on another person, and finally on the integration of ourself with compassionate presence to others. Mindsight is about recognizing what energy and information are alive in our experience, a flow that exists both within ourselves and between us and others. So Mindsight, the ability to see or observe our own minds and the minds of others, is about recognizing that we're a distinct self and we're also interconnected to others. And Mindsight is something we can learn and train ourselves to do. Our minds can cause our brains to grow. We can train our brains to shift their automatic ways of working. So on the next slide, I have a couple of definitions written down for you, and I've cited 2 books that I am drawing from for this webinar. The first I already referenced, Daniel Siegel, Mindsight. The subtitle is The New Science of Personal Transformation. It was published in 2011, but it's just a gold mine of understanding and practices that I think are important for ministry leaders. Siegel says that Mindsight is a term both for how we see our own minds and the minds of others, and for our ability to honor our differentiated natures at the same time as we link with one another. There's a lot of similar ideas that form the basis of another book published in 2019 by Kleiner, Schwartz, and Thompson. It's called The Wise Advocate. It's a leadership book that's published by Columbia Business School, The Inner Voice of Strategic Leadership. And here they write about 2 skills, mindfulness and mentalizing. It's very similar to what Daniel Siegel is talking about when he uses the term Mindsight. Mindfulness is looking inward, clear-minded awareness of one's own mental activity, and mentalizing is imagining another person's inner world, paying close attention to what other people are thinking and are likely to do next. So let's practice a little bit. And the first movement is turning inward. And on the next slide, I have an acronym, SIFT, S-I-F-T, and it stands for sensation, images, feelings, and thoughts. So if you would like to try this practice, I invite you to close your eyes again and to reflect with me on these 4 aspects of your current reality. With your eyes closed, ask yourself, what am I sensing in my body right now? You might feel some tension in your muscles. Perhaps you are aware of your heart beating. You might be aware of your lungs taking in air. You might feel just a wash of sensations from your body as a whole. What sensations are you noticing in your body right now? Next, what images come up in your mind's eye? Images can take many forms. They might be visual. You might have images of sound or touch, maybe an image of a memory in your past or a hope for your future. It's not necessary to put these images into words, just be aware of what images are coming up in your mind's eye right now. And now we turn to feelings. What feelings are alive inside of you at this moment? Emotions can involve our bodily sensations, but they also link our bodies to our thoughts, to our memories, to our perceptions. Being aware of your feelings may fill you with a wash of energy. You might not quite be sure how to name it. That's fine. No words are necessary. Just be aware of your emotional state. What feelings are alive inside of you? And finally, what thoughts are streaming through your consciousness? It's okay if you can't define quite what those thoughts are. It's possible that you might hear an inner voice that is telling you something of your thoughts. You might have a sense that has no words attached to it. However, your thoughts emerge, let yourself be aware of whatever is coming up for you at this given moment. And you may open your eyes now and we can stop the slideshow. This brief practice sift sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts is something you can just check in with yourself about in moments where you have just a minute of time to pause. It's a way of being aware of your inner experience. And it's the first step in Mindsight, checking in with yourself. The second step is mentalizing, imagining others' inner experience. I'm not going to lead you through this right now, but I'm going to give you an example of what you could do if you wanted to try it. Mentalizing, imagining others' inner experience can be tried by finding a short clip from a film or going to a public place and engaging in people watching. And if you are using a film or a video clip or some kind of a movie segment for this, turn off the sound so you cannot hear what characters are saying in the script. Just watch their faces and their body language and see if you can identify what feelings they might be having in that moment. You could also try it with video in a language that you do not understand. If you want to get some verbal sound with it as well and some audio with it as well. But Daniel Siegel suggests this practice, and he says, don't worry about accuracy. Just inviting yourself to imagine the mind of another person activates the prefrontal regions in your brain that will grow stronger by this kind of perspective taking. So as you practice your ability to attend to other people's emotional states, you will grow in your empathy and your ability to mentalize with people you actually know. So I invite you to consider giving that practice a try in order to grow in your capacity for the second step of Mindsight, sensing what is going on within another person. This capacity of Mindsight, I think, is particularly useful when something happens in our communities, in our congregations that leaves us feeling unsettled. It happens a lot in human community. Because the work of a pastor or a ministry leader is particularly personal, meaning it often arises from a deep sense of calling, there can be a lot that unsettles us because it touches us at a deep level, a level of our own purpose and our own calling. And if we lack the tools to be able to process those feelings and process our immediate experiences, we're not going to be able to distinguish ourselves from our lives in communities where we're experiencing conflict. It takes an enormous amount of inner resources to be sustained in ministry. It is very hard work. It's personal work, it's prayerful work, it's work in the midst of others who may or may not be doing their own personal work themselves. And as I read through the Gospels, I really see Jesus demonstrating this kind of capacity for mindsight, the ability to look deeply into his own inner life, to commune with God in solitude and in silence, in prayer at night and early in the morning, and then to minister out of that with compassion for others. Often in the Gospels, we read that Jesus was deeply moved. He was moved at a gut level of empathy with compassion as he notices others and sees their need and has the resources to respond because he's taken that time to attend to his own inner life. Jesus definitely had moments of getting swept up, of acting out in anger because he was so offended at injustice. And so to practice mindsight isn't to say that we are always cool, calm, and collected. Part of mindsight, I think, is being intentional about action and about resistance. But we do so while remaining in touch with our own inner experience of reality and trying to remain connected to others as well. Jesus had an extraordinary ability for empathy, and he had so much clarity about his sense of self and how he was differentiated, but how he was also interconnected. So I want to lead us in a brief exercise of Lectio Divina. This is a bit of trying to imagine perhaps the inner realities of others. I've chosen a passage from Matthew chapter 12 where Jesus is in conflict with the Pharisees. I'm going to read verses 1 through 14. And I'll do an abbreviated Lectio Divina exercise here. I invite you to pay attention to a word or phrase that stands out in this passage for you that you think suggests the way that someone was feeling in their own inner world in one of these two scenes. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." He said to them, "Have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? How he entered the house of God, and they ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." He left that place and entered their synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, "Is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath?" so that they might accuse him. He said to them, Suppose one of you has only one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. We'll engage one more time in this Lectio Divina exercise, this divine reading of Scripture. And as we do so, I invite you to listen again for that word or phrase that stood out to you and to focus in on it. What meaning might it hold in this passage in terms of what is going on in the inner world of one of the characters in these stories? Again, from Matthew chapter 12, 1 through 14. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. He said to them, have you not read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? How he entered the house of God and they ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him or his companions to eat, but only for the priests? Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and yet are guiltless? I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. He left that place and entered their synagogue. A man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, is it lawful to cure on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. He said to them, suppose one of you has only one sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Then he said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and it was restored, as sound as the other. But the Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. It's fascinating to me the ways that Jesus is interacting in these passages. His disciples are present, the Pharisees are present, and there's also another man who's present in the synagogue who experiences restoration through Jesus' healing. I think even in these brief verses that we've been focusing on here through Lectio Divina, Jesus is showing how he senses the inner world of others. He notices what the Pharisees are thinking about, maybe what's running through their minds, and he draws from their own authoritative scriptures and law in order to connect with them over the questions that they are asking. It seems to me in the second scene in the synagogue that Jesus is even imagining the Pharisees as having some empathy or compassion for a sheep that falls into a pit. And not only does he argue with or engage with these Pharisees, but he also notices the person who they were simply treating as an object lesson, the man with the withered hand. And Jesus reaches out to him in compassion. In order to do this, we know how much Jesus practiced his own times of solitude and mindsight, how he was aware of his own inner realities and how he drew strength from his time spent with God. This reminds me of 3 parts of Mindsight. And here we'll go to our next slide. They are called openness, observation, and objectivity. Daniel Siegel, this author who I'm drawing from, loves to use alliteration and loves to make acronyms. So we have SIFT, sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. And we have 3 O's: openness, observation, and objectivity. So openness is the first step in sensing our inner world or that of another person. It's an invitation to be present, to hold what is happening right now without judgment. It's about our subjective focus on our immediate experience. This, without judgment, is a really important part of the openness. When we are not our best selves, when we are not practicing Mindsight, and I'll get to in a little bit how we can have some signs that we are not practicing Mindsight, that we're not in that reality. We often act with judgments when we are not able to be open, when we are not practicing Mindsight. Openness is to hold what is present without judging it as right or wrong, what we should or should not be doing, or what another, if we're focusing on someone else, what another person should or should not be doing or thinking. It is our subjective focus on immediate experience without judgment. If we can hold this kind of openness, it allows us to go deeper and take a step back in observation. We notice what's alive, what the flow of energy is, and where it might be arising from. It's about a sense of taking a step back and noticing where that energy is coming from, where it's going, and being able to gain a broader perspective on our immediate experience. So in openness, we hold what's happening right now. In observation, we take a step back and we notice where that happening might be coming from and where it's going. And then objectivity takes us deeper yet by taking another step back, recognizing that the happening, where it's coming from and where it's going, is a moment in time. And our feelings and our immediate sensations do not define the total of who we are, or the total of who another person is, or even the total of what reality is. Observation comes when we're no longer swept away in the flood of emotions and energy. By using this word objectivity, which typically I do not like to use because I'm a practical theologian, and I don't really think objectivity is ever truly possible. The way this word is used here is about not saying that we can be so distant, that we can take so many steps back, that we ever lose our own personal viewpoint. But it's about recognizing that what we see and what we observe isn't all there is. It's not absolute reality. There's more to it. We might say God is doing something more that we cannot see. There's something about another person that we don't fully understand, try as we may. There's even something about ourselves that we have yet to discover. Objectivity is about recognizing that these feelings and sensations are moments in time. They don't define us or our reality. What we think we know is really an object of our mind. And these Mindsight practices can be tools that help us develop these capacities for openness, for observation, and for objectivity. One way that we can practice Mindsight is by shifting the way we think about and hold our feelings and how we equate ourselves with them. We can turn the slides off for a moment now again. Let's say we are having a strong feeling. Perhaps we're having a feeling of fear, and we might be aware and saying to ourselves, I am afraid. This is good, a good awareness, and it's important to recognize our feelings. But when we reduce ourselves to that feeling, we're losing this kind of objectivity by thinking to ourselves, I am afraid. So a step toward objectivity would be, after noticing it, that's the openness. I am afraid. To recognize that as an observation, take one step back and to say, I feel fear. Notice the shift from I am afraid to I feel fear. And here's the objectivity, to take another step back yet and say, I am aware of feeling fear. I'll say those three again. I am afraid, that's the openness. I feel fear, that's the observation. I am aware of feeling fear, that's the objectivity. And we can do these exercises in the prayerful presence of God and welcome the awareness and move into the observation and to the objectivity. Once we are aware of these kinds of feelings and where they might be arising from, where they might be going, we can then explore further what may have triggered this feeling within us. Our feelings are brought on when we have needs that might be met or might not be met. And when we experience the energy flow of so-called negative emotions like fear, or perhaps hurt or anger, in welcoming those feelings, in being open, in being observational and being objective, we can try to search for their source and understand and be curious about them. In doing so, perhaps we might discover that we deeply value something that's missing. Or maybe we are longing for something that we don't quite feel we have. We might have a deep need and we don't sense that others around us even recognize that need. When we can practice openness and observation and objectivity, that's about this process of being more aware of what's going on inside us so we can understand it better. And then we can be more intentional in our actions rather than getting swept away by these feelings of confusion. We can explore them and be curious about them. When we are not able to practice openness, we find ourselves kind of on one side or another, either in a very rigid state or in a state of chaos. And either one of those is missing the capacity for mindsight. I think about this when I reflect on experiences in communities, in society, in the church. You can often describe some of those as states of rigidity or experiences of chaos. What we're looking for is the middle road, which is integration, where we can be connected to one another and we can imagine what's going on inside another person and we can connect ourselves with them. But these feelings, either in rigidity or in chaos, are very uncomfortable. I think we know it when we're on one of those ends and not experiencing the middle road of integration. We might feel out of control of ourselves. We might feel out of touch with ourselves or one another. And when we find ourselves in these disintegrated states, we can try to be open and practice these tools of mindsight in order to understand them better and what gave rise to them. So I'm going to share now some signs that appear when we are in these states of disintegration, when we are lacking the capacity for mindsight. What are signs that we're losing that? And what might we be able to do to move back toward integration? Here are some signs that we may be losing our capacity for mindsight, moving into rigidity or into chaos. Emphasizing, let's get this over as quickly as possible. It's called expedience. We might want to relieve the tension or the discomfort as soon as possible. That's a sign that we are losing our capacity for mindsight. Focusing on these kinds of expediency questions. What's in it for me? How much is it worth? How can we just close the deal? What do others want me to do? These are signs that we're losing our capacity for mindsight. When we have feelings of envy or pride, it's a state of rigidity that we're losing our capacity for mindsight. When we're focused mainly on a reward that will come, or a prize maybe, or a transaction, what can I get out of the other person? What can they give me that I want? When we have a desire just to get to a goal as quickly as possible, and maybe we're going to look for the simplest and fastest way to get there, that's a sign we're losing our capacity for mindsight. When we're willing to follow a simple solution, even if harm is done to others or to our relationships. When we find ourselves being fixated on what's wrong with someone else, with what we perceive as their deficit or their weaknesses, we've lost our capacity for mindsight. When in our own inner lives, we hear discouraging self-talk. I've messed up again. I am never going to get this right. Of course it would go that way for me. I can't do anything well. When we find ourselves spiraling into addictive or excessive behaviors, what those are is often a plea or a grasping for relief, but it's a sign that we've lost our capacity for mindsight and it's moving into us to a state of chaos. When our relationships are strained with our friends and loved ones, when we are frequently spiraling into arguments, it's a capacity that we've lost our capacity, a sign we've lost our capacity for mindsight. When we feel a sense of distance from our loved ones, and when we feel a distance from ourselves, a sense of inner disconnection or a feeling of numbness. Now, I want to say that sometimes it's necessary to be expedient, to make a quick decision, or to work at a simple solution. Sometimes we do make negotiations and ask, what does the other person want and what's in it for me? But if we are only or always operating out of this kind of a frame of mind, we're not honoring the depths of our God-created self or connecting with others who God has made good. Leadership, innovation, and transformation cannot take place with this kind of approach. In some leadership texts, it's called a low ground approach. That's what the authors of the Wise Advocate use, that kind of terminology. So be attentive to these kinds of mental states of non-integration. They shouldn't become a pattern or become our continuous way of being. If you find yourself no longer able to empathize with others, or if you find yourself not able to feel your own body or emotional states, if you feel like you're moving through life in a state of numbness, this is a sign of disintegration. You're distanced from your compassionate vocation of ministry, of pastoral presence, and you are in danger of experiencing harm to yourself or causing it to others. So here are some practices that I want to leave you with. I've led you through a couple. Let's take a look at this slide to connect with yourself and with others, to cultivate Mindsight. As the strategic leadership authors of the Wise Advocate put it, the focus of your attention determines what happens in the mind and brain during your critical moments of choice, and that determines what kind of a leader you can be. So here are ways to focus our attention on our own inner reality or on the inner reality of someone else, and to connect those. I have combined here a number of spiritual practices with a variety of other practices that can help create this kind of attentive presence for us. Visio Divina is, I led us through Lectio Divina. Visio Divina is gazing at a piece of artwork or an image and inviting God to speak to us through it by seeing what we notice there. Tactio Divina is holding something that's tactile in our hands and touching an object and inviting God to bring meaning to us through that. Lectio, the Latin for reading. Imaginative scripture reading is the imagining of yourself in a passage of scripture, or imagining the ways that the characters are seen in that scripture passage may have happened or may have been feeling or interacting with each other. We did a body scan to begin this webinar this evening. Reflective journaling or writing poetry can be a way of attending to your inner life or the inner life of another. Being aware of your breath and taking moments to just pay attention to that inner and outer rhythm in your lungs. Here's an interesting one. Systematically tensing, so you might want to try this right now, to make a fist and clamp tight with your fingers, and then releasing your muscles. And you can actually do this not just with your hands, but from feet to head. You could try it with your feet, with your head, with your neck, with your shoulders, to alternate between tensing and then releasing and relaxing those muscles. And you can do that several times, and that makes you aware of your own bodily state. Some people find it helpful to do tapping motions, to gently tap, alternating the left and then the right sides of their body. by crossing their arms over their body and tapping one hand and then the other on either side in a rhythmic manner. Placing one hand over your heart and another over your abdomen. And if we have a little bit of time, I might lead you through one of those exercises in the Q&A time. I think it might relate. To get some aerobic exercise, however that happens for you. Novelty exposure. This is a way that you can train your brain to get out of a rut or to get out of its automatic patterns of thinking, to expose yourself to something new. You might visit a new place, or you might meet someone who you have not met before, or you might do this through media as well. But to expose yourself to something new is good for your brain, and it builds your capacity for mindsight. Emotional engagement. To do something that lets you feel your feelings. To imagine a serene place and to allow yourself to go there and to imagine the feelings of being in a beautiful place of safety and serenity. To do a guided imagination exercise. There's many of these exercises that are widely available online to do a guided imagery exercise. You might find it enjoyable to do a walking meditation. So even as you are meditating prayerfully and focusing your attention, to give your body something to do by walking as you engage in that. And finally, to receive empathy from others. I think this is a particularly vulnerable aspect of pastoral ministry, to be giving compassionate care to others. And because of a position of power that the pastor is in, it can be ethically complex to receive empathy, particularly in a congregational setting. Who are the colleagues and friends and peers outside of a ministry context who can give empathy to the pastoral leader? Because pastoral leaders need to receive empathy too. And receiving that can help build the capacity for Mindsight. So I invite you to try some of these practices of Mindsight in order to better understand your own inner world and imagine the inner world of another person. And by doing so, I believe that we do what we are growing in what Jesus said was the greatest and the second command, which is to love God with all of ourselves as we love our neighbor as ourselves. And so I hope you will try some of these and find them helpful in building your capacity for Mindsight. And you can close the slides.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for that. There's a lot to unpack. I think if you're watching on the chat, you'll see that in the follow-up email, you will get that PowerPoint presentation too as kind of a refresher. I know I was scribbling notes, but then it's like, oh yeah, I could probably get access to this. But thank you for this and all the different concepts that you're talking about, and really the practical grounding. And what I appreciate about you is your love for church leaders and pastors, and the desire that, or really the acknowledgement that the work that pastors do matters, and that how they do it matters, and their health and vitality matters, and it matters not just to them, but to the communities they serve and beyond. So thank you so much for that grounding in practical theology, I guess. A few questions. There was one that came in while you were talking, and I'll just read it. It'll go off to the side here, but how does the concept of Mindsight help in understanding and improving interpersonal relationships and understanding congregational culture?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this ability to practice Mindsight, first of all, we have to have a sense of ourselves. it's we don't act out of a place of integrity or of grounding if we try to imagine what's going on in someone else, if we haven't even paid attention to ourselves. That skews our interpretive lens as well. So that's why the first step is to pay attention to ourselves. But we can imagine what might be going on in someone else's experience. For me, when I find myself jumping to judgments because I'm in a pretty rigid state of disintegration, I try to slow myself down and to practice openness and to list. I mean, I have 5 fingers on one hand, so to list at least 5 different reasons why I could imagine someone might have acted the way they did, or might have said what they did. Even just disciplining myself to imagine 4 other possibilities than the one that I jumped to right away helps me to approach them with a little bit more empathy. And that builds this capacity for mindsight. So when I discipline myself to practice that, then it helps in other relationships. It actually trains my brain to jump to those possibilities faster in every subsequent interaction that I have. So I think in a congregational setting, if we have even a few folks who are working on this to practice this, it will begin to change a culture. So we can seek to have empathy with a culture as well. We can also infiltrate a culture to plant more empathy there. Because remember that one of the ways to cultivate mindsight is to receive others' empathy. So just by some people practicing empathy, that will create a more compassionate culture within a congregation. So I think, yeah, I just think about the possibilities for transformation that this kind of practice has. And even if there's just a few people who are working at this, it can change a culture.
Yeah, as you were answering it, another question came in that is actually related to something you just said. But the question, yeah, it's a little bit of a longer. It says, I think one of my challenges is that I may overly imagine and empathize with how another person may be feeling. I found that when I last served in a congregational pastoral setting, that I wore myself out by repeatedly standing in another's shoes to imagine what a congregant was experiencing. Do you have advice for how to mentalize others' inner experiences without becoming overwhelmed by the other's needs?
Mm-hmm. I really appreciate that question. And I think depending on one's personality, this may be more or less of a tendency. And so it's so important to pay attention to this. Here again, the attention to self comes first. And so we can also imagine this as a cycle. So, or a back and forth kind of rhythm. So as much attention as is paid to another, we also need to give ourselves that kind of attention as well. But there's also this, and here's where I do find the words observation and objectivity, which I kind of wince at. I find them helpful because it is good to imagine what others may be thinking and feeling. But that's not the same as taking responsibility for those feelings onto ourselves or internalizing them and carrying them along as our own. When we take those steps back, we can observe and we can practice the objectivity while still remaining differentiated. So here's where the word integration has both difference and linkage as part of it. And when we have been overzealous on the linkage part, but not recognized enough of the differentiation, I think that's when we can start feeling so overwhelmed by imagining and empathizing with another person. It's important to take care of ourselves and to recognize that we can be empathetic without being responsible for what someone else is experiencing.
Just as you were talking, one thing I thought is that, well, this difference between, so imagining what a person may be feeling
Yep.
is actually not the same as knowing what a person is feeling or experiencing. And how
Exactly.
do you work at like bridging that gap in terms of actually engaging people and trying to figure out, because sometimes when we imagine, we also imagine wrongly.
Yep.
And
Yep.
then that can get
Right.
us in a different space as well. So how do you balance this kind of internal work that you're talking about with the kind of engagement with another human, right, in the pastoral setting?
Yeah, so we don't want to make assumptions and judgments about others by thinking we know what their experience is.
Mm-hmm.
The practice of imagining and recognizing that it's just an imagining, that's all it is, can prompt us to ask new kinds of questions or engage to connect with another person in ways that we might not have tended to before. So the imagining of someone else's experience, I think, can be a beautiful part of prayer journaling or a part of the pastoral leader's own personal practice. But we would never then go to them and say, I think I know what you must be feeling. We might ask a question. We might say, I was reflecting on what you said, and I wondered if it might be related to this. And that kind of questioning will give the other person the freedom to say, oh, yes, that is that is it. Or say, no, you've got it wrong. So we hold those imaginations so loosely, they're not what's actually going on. They're preparing us for connection, not for actually knowing what another person's experience is.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you. I will say that I wrote this quote down. You said the attention to self comes first, unquote. I probably know what I'm going to ask, but I hope you can appreciate, like, I think I appreciated, or what stuck out to me was that in our religious traditions, often it's not a message you hear. And especially for some pastoral ministries, and especially for women, like, your job is to serve others at all costs and to die to self. All this kind of language doesn't encourage that, and yet I think you're right. How do you work at this theologically? Like, how do you
Yeah.
given that that's your training? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's right there in what Jesus says, what's the greatest commandment in the law, and the second is like it.
Yeah.
Self is implied in both of them.
Yeah.
Love God with all your being. Well, we have to have a sense of self in order to do that. We have to have a sense of what is our strength and soul and heart and mind. That's about self-knowledge in order to love God deeply with all of our being and to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, I can't love my neighbor as myself if I don't know about myself. So to me, those things are implied. And then when we see the kinds of rhythms that Jesus had, he would get up early in the morning to spend time alone. That's the pattern that I see in the Gospels in Jesus' ministry of putting self first, and that fueled his ministry of compassion to others. So putting the self first isn't being selfish, it's being responsible, it's fueling up for ministry in order to do what God is calling us to do.
Yeah, thank you. A few more, if you're willing.
Yep.
First one is how do you relate calmly to individuals exhibiting great hostility and distrust?
This is so hard because it's so easy to get swept away in the hostility and distrust of someone else. It also, I know for me, feels personally attacking, and then I go into a defensive mode, and I totally lose touch with my sense of self and my ability to imagine four other things that might be giving rise to this person's behavior. So I had seen this question before because it came in on the registrations, and I really liked it because it's so practical. And so I picked out a practice from another one of Daniel Siegel's books. This is actually a book he wrote for teenagers to practice Mindsight, which I highly recommend. It's called Brainstorm. And he suggests that we can engage in a practice of reflecting on an experience where we felt hostility or distrust. So before or after this kind of experience, we can either prepare ourselves for a confrontation, or we can process a confrontation afterward with this kind of practice. So he invites us to try to sense what may have been going on in our life at that moment, and the kinds of emotions and thoughts or images that were flooding through us, and to connect with those. And then to explore what parts of ourselves felt threatened or felt disintegrated in that moment. And then here's where the hand over the heart and the hand over the abdomen comes into play. When we feel swept away by someone else's emotions or our response to them, if we place one hand over our heart and the other over our abdomen and apply a little bit of pressure, it can bring us back to a sense of presence. So this feels awkward to do when someone's standing there and shouting at you, right? But you can do it if you can get a moment afterward or in the midst of a contentious meeting, for instance, to turn around, to pause, to walk out for a drink of water, and just to apply this kind of pressure on our hand and on our abdomen. And it can actually help us to calm down. Something else we can do in the midst of a hot conversation where someone is being hostile or talking about distrust is to do the kind of breathing that I suggested in the body scan. When we're experiencing intense emotions and they're starting to feel like they're carrying us away, our breath will often shorten. Like if you think of hyperventilation or even crying, it's like taking in lots of deep breaths really fast. If we reverse that, it actually calms our nervous system down and we'll be able to stay more present. So literally, if someone is being hostile, if you have the presence of mind to breathe in for 2 seconds and breathe out for 3 seconds, so breathing out longer than you're breathing in, it will literally calm your system down in the moment and allow you to check in with yourself and remain present. So those are a couple of suggestions that I have physiologically for how we could relate calmly to someone who's being hostile.
Yeah. Well, let's hope people don't have that experience too often, but it does
right.
happen.
It happens.
One of the questions that came in also pre-registration has to do with like pastoral practices that are really an application for how do you deal with this, or what kind of practices are helpful for members with differing views on current polarization over presidential politics. You may not want to wade into that water, but is there a specific application for even congregational behavior as members find themselves in these kind of polarized setting?
Yeah, this is where I really think the language of needs can be helpful as we imagine what might be going on for another person who has very different views from us. And in fact, in thinking about the presidential election, even whose views might feel threatening to our sense of safety. I think it's helpful to imagine, to ask ourselves, are there needs that this other person may have that they don't feel are being met in the current, whatever situation it is that they disagree with? Is there a need for safety? Is there a need for well-being? Is there a need for a feeling of security? Is there a need for being seen or recognized that they feel that is missing from their current experience? And I think when we can imagine that even though someone's behavior feel or their viewpoint feels really offensive to us, they may be kind of grasping to have a need met that is unfulfilled for them at that time. I think it can really help us to humanize others again and to see them beyond the kind of polarization and othering and objectifying of people that is so often going on.
So one more question that also came in and has to do with applying this to leadership teams. The question is, how might a congregational leadership team employ corporate mindsight as a practice for leading in a congregation or neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
Is there
Yeah.
a kind of communal application to this?
Yeah. So I mentioned already that if you kind of plant a couple of empathetic people, it can spread throughout a congregational culture. I think it can also be helpful um, to engage in storytelling or story listening as a team, because as we listen to one another in the congregation, I think it can be helpful for leadership teams to reflect together on what they heard or what seemed important about that, because each person is going to have a slightly different perspective. So, for instance, if they were trying to practice mindsight, to mentalize what someone else may be thinking or feeling, to actually do that together corporately can be really fascinating, because it shows how we all might imagine slightly different things, but it still builds our capacity for mindsight. And a leadership team could engage in that kind of practice that would help them probably see new things in new ways that they hadn't before.
So if people on on this webinar are interested in learning more about this or engaging you or the resources at EMS, what's the best way for them to do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I can be reached at my first name dot last name at emu.edu. That's my email address, Sarah.Bixler at emu.edu. And I've recommended two books that you might want to check out as well: Mindsight by Daniel Siegel and The Wise Advocate, The Inner Voice of Strategic Leadership. That's by three authors, Kleiner, Schwartz, and Thompson. I had those on the slides with some quotes from those two books. We also have a number of different seminars and workshops for ministry leaders through the Shalom Collaboratory at Eastern Mennonite Seminary, and practices of adaptive leadership, of compassionate awareness, and of resilience practices in the midst of trauma are just a couple of things that we offer for further training and learning for pastoral leaders.
Excellent. Sarah, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your leadership at Eastern Mennonite Seminary and your love for the church and for your insights tonight. Just a couple parting things. One, for the latest news and events from MCUSA, be sure to subscribe to Peacemail. That is MCUSA's weekly e-newsletter. Also, tune into the Competent Pastor podcast. There's 4 episodes. Sarah was number 3, if you want to go back and listen to that. Glenn Guyton, Melissa Flora Bixler, Rod Stafford have been folks we've interviewed. Rachel and I have a blast doing it. Great conversations. And coming up, we'll have a conversation with Bishop Francisco, combination with Megan, Larissa Good, and others. So check that out. And yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And yeah, blessings to everyone that was on the webinar tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.